Welcome to the Evidential Faith Podcast, where a father-son duo explore the scientific, historical, and philosophical evidence for the God of the Bible. The goal of this podcast is to encourage believers and challenge skeptics to consider the reliability of Jesus in the Bible. What is up, podcast listeners? Welcome back to the Evidential Faith Podcast. My name is Jake Nash. With me, as always, is my dad and my co-host, Troy Nash. Thank you guys for tuning in today. If you keep up with the podcast on a weekly basis, you might know that it's been a while, but we're excited to be back today and hopefully make more consistent content for you guys. So today we are going to continue our topic of things that people claim as reasons that they reject Christianity. And today we're going to discuss the topic of miracles. And I actually understand the objection of miracles, especially in the context of like our modern Western culture. Many people today hold to what's called a naturalistic worldview. So that means that they believe in the natural world, the universe, the laws that govern it, and that is all that exists. And if that's true, then miracles simply can't happen because by definition, a miracle is an event that cannot be explained by natural causes. It's something supernatural, something that goes beyond the normal laws of nature. So if nature is all that there is, miracles are impossible. But the Bible is full of miracles, from turning water into wine to parting the Red Sea to the resurrection itself. If miracles can't happen, then Christianity falls apart. And that's why it's such an important topic, because though miracles are difficult to understand, they're even harder to believe if you've never personally witnessed one. So it's no surprise that many people see them as a reason for unbelief. But Christians, we believe miracles can and do happen. So today we're going to look at a couple things. First, we're going to look at the evidence for miracles in the Bible, and then we're going to look at examples of well-documented miracles in modern day, because they still do happen. So before that, why does this even matter? Well, miracles have huge philosophical implications, because if miracles exist, that means that the natural universe is not all that exists. It means that there's something beyond nature, something supernatural that can intervene in the world. And even if one genuine miracle occurs, then strict naturalism, atheism, materialism cannot be true if even just one has ever happened. And if we can find good evidence that the miracles recorded in the Bible actually happened, that strengthens the case for Christianity, especially the case for the resurrection. So let's dive into the Bible, and we're going to look at a few of them. So as Frank Turek often says, if you can grant me the first 10 words of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, then every other miracle in the Bible is at least possible. And if God exists, miracles are not difficult for him, right? If he created everything, he can do anything. But how do we know that miracles described in the Bible actually occurred? Because we weren't there, right? So how can we prove it? Well, I think we can evaluate any event in history from a few different angles: historical documents, eyewitness testimonies, and archaeological discoveries. So we obviously don't have time to look at all the miraculous events in the Bible, but we're going to focus today on two, and we've discussed both of these in different episodes, but I think that they're important, so we're going to discuss them again. One from the Old Testament, one from the New. We're going to discuss the Exodus and the resurrection. So the Exodus is probably, I would say, the most, if not one of the most dramatic miracles in the Old Testament, when God delivers the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and leads them towards the Promised Land. And this story includes a lot of famous miracles, all the plagues, parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army, all this kind of stuff. And for many years, critics claimed that there was no evidence that the Exodus even happened, or that the Israelites were ever even in Egypt. But archaeology has discovered several interesting pieces of evidence that support the Exodus. So we're just going to look at a few, and there's extensive research on this. There's much more than this, but we're just going to look at a few of them. So first, an example of this is called the Brooklyn Papyrus, and it's called the Brooklyn Papyrus because it's housed in the Brooklyn Museum. But it's a list of household servant names in Egypt from about the 17th century BC. And it's interesting because a lot of these names, I think there's about 90 of the names on this papyrus, and about 30 of them are Semitic Hebrew-style names. Semitic is kind of the parent language that Hebrew falls into, and about 9 of them are like specific, what we would call biblical Hebrew names. Things like, Joseph, Jacob, Benjamin, like those kinds of names that we see during this time are recorded in Egypt itself. And that doesn't prove the Exodus itself, but it shows that there were Hebrew people living in Egypt around the time that the Bible says that they were.
And those names would be much different than Egyptian names. Is that what you're pointing out?
Very,
Egyptian
very
names?
different.
Yeah.
And it's actually interesting because in this papyrus, you have the list of the Hebrew names because they're household servant names. You have the list of the Hebrew names and then the list of their accompanying Egyptian names. So those people were given Egyptian names, just like Joseph was or Moses was. We see that when these Hebrew people came to Egypt, they were recorded and then given Egyptian names. So you can see like, hey, this Joseph called whatever. And they're very, very different from each other. So you can tell that these are Hebrew names. So another piece of evidence comes from the tomb of Rekhmir. This is a tomb that's kind of on the other side of where the Valley of Kings is, where all the pharaohs were. And this is kind of where like noble people, high-ranking people that weren't pharaohs or related to the pharaohs were buried. And this tomb dates back to many people believe like it was finished just 4 years before when the Bible says the Exodus took place. And in this tomb on the walls are paintings of, Egyptian hieroglyph paintings of slaves that were not Egyptian, but from somewhere else, just based on like the skin color and things like that. They're slaves that were making bricks out of straws. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the book of Exodus describes the Israelites being forced to make bricks from straws in Egypt. And this doesn't prove the Exodus narrative, but it does demonstrate the kind of forced labor described in the Bible for the Israelite slaves was actually happening during the time that it said to these people that, based on the hieroglyphs, were not Egyptian slaves. So finally, and I think most interestingly, and I think we've touched on this in the past, and there is a great video by Expedition Bible about this, but we believe that we know who the mummy is, we know who the pharaoh of the Exodus is, and we have his mummy. His name is Amenhotep II, and we think this is the pharaoh of the Exodus for a few reasons. First, the timing of his reign fits extremely well, which one of the major biblical chronologies of the Exodus. When historians line up Egyptian records from the timeline described in the Exodus, his reign fits like right in there. Second, the length of his father's reign. We know from the Exodus that whoever the pharaoh of the Exodus is, his father reigned for a very long time because Moses had to go away from Egypt because that pharaoh, the Exodus pharaoh's father, wanted to kill him. And so Exodus says he goes away for a very long time, and then that pharaoh dies, and then he comes back, and his Amenhotep's father reigns for like more than, I think it's like 40 years or something, which fits very well with that account in Exodus. But maybe I think the most fascinating details come from Amenhotep's tomb itself. So we've discovered his mummy, and in the same tomb, they also found the mummy of a prince believed to be his son because he has what's called a prince's lock. I think if you've ever seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, actually, it's about the Exodus. The Prince of Egypt has this lock where it's like his head is shaved and then he has like a ponytail coming out the side of his head, and this young boy, this prince, has this. And this is interesting because we know that Egyptian mummies, pharaoh mummies specifically, are always the last people to be put in their tomb. So when a new pharaoh comes into power, they start immediately building him a tomb, and then that tomb houses any family members for him that die before him, and then he is the last one to go in when he dies, and then it's sealed off. So the fact that this son, this prince, this young boy who's about 15, his mummy is in this tomb shows that he died before the pharaoh. And that lines up exactly like the Exodus account, the 10th plague, where God kills all the firstborn sons of Egypt. So it's really interesting that he is in there. Another interesting thing about the mummy himself, about Amenhotep, is if you look at the pictures of the mummy, he has these really weird like skin lesions, almost looking like boils on his skin. Like he has these really weird all over his skin, and there's no other mummy that we have that has these things on them, and nobody really knows what they are. But it immediately brings to mind the 6th plague of the Exodus, when painful boils broke out all over the Egyptians, and he's covered in these things.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's it's like, wow, the timeline lines up, his father lines up, how he looks lines up, his dead son lines up. Like, it's like, it looks like he is the Pharaoh. So, none of this, like, by itself in a silo can prove the Exodus, but it does show that these biblical accounts aren't just myths. They aren't just, like, made up. Like, these were real people, real events, and it's very, very good evidence for a miraculous event like the Exodus. So moving to the New Testament, we've talked in previous episodes about the New Testament and the reliability of the New Testament from a historical standpoint, specifically the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These documents weren't written. They were written in the first century within the lifetime of eyewitnesses to the events they described. And they contain numerous historical verifiable details such as like place names, cultural references, political figures, and archaeological sites such as like the pool of Bethesda that we mentioned in our archaeology episode. So because of this, many historians, even skeptical ones, acknowledge that the Gospels are valuable historical sources for studying the life of Jesus. But they often argue that like the miraculous stories are simply legends that were added later. So I think that Jesus performs many, many miracles in the Gospels, from his first miracle of turning water into wine, to walking on water, to healing the sick and the lame and the blind, and raising Lazarus from the dead. But I think, like we've talked about before, I think it's important to focus on his greatest miracle, his own resurrection, because to me, it's like to anybody who follows Christ, that is the central point of Christianity.
Yeah.
And we've done a whole episode on this, so I'll keep it brief. But the four Gospels agree on several key facts. Jesus was crucified, he died, he was buried, and 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and his followers claimed to have seen him alive. And this is, even skeptics agree on this. Bart Ehrman says, like, we can know four things for sure, and it's those four things. He was crucified, he died under Pontius Pilate, he died, he was buried, and 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and his followers claimed to have seen him alive. Some critics point out that the resurrection accounts contain minor differences. For example, who arrived at the tomb first, and how many angels were present, and what exactly was said to the people that got there, to Mary or to John or whoever got to the tomb, and people point these out, saying this is contradictions, that you can't trust these accounts. But interestingly, these differences actually strengthen the credibility of the accounts. Former homicide detective J. Warner Wallace, he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, and he often points out that in real criminal investigations, eyewitness testimonies rarely ever match perfectly. If you're given multiple witnesses to an event or a crime, if they give identical stories with every detail the same, that is a key to investigators saying this is suspicious, there is some conspiracy going on between these witnesses, because real eyewitnesses' testimony usually contains small variation but still agree on the central event. And I'll give you an example from history. Titanic.
Yeah.
Survivors were interviewed about their experiences, and they gave wildly different answers about, the time that the ship sank, and whether the ship actually broke in two or it just sank in one piece, and what music the band was playing as it sank. They're wildly different accounts, but they all agreed on one simple fact: the ship sank. And the same pattern appears in the resurrection details. There are minor differences in the secondary details, but all four Gospels agree that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and that's the key. On top of that, after Jesus' resurrection, there is good evidence for that based on the dramatic change in Jesus' disciples. Before he was resurrected, after he died, the disciples were terrified. They scattered, they went into hiding, they were afraid. And they thought they were going to be arrested. They thought they were next. But then a few days later, they're in the public square preaching boldly that Jesus is risen from the dead. And they continue to proclaim this message even when it costs them their freedom and in a lot of cases their lives. And history records that several of the apostles were executed for their claims, like we've talked about in the past. As we've said before, people will sometimes die for what they believe to be true, whether it's a religious belief or a political belief, whatever. But no one is willing to die for what they know to be a lie. And if the disciples had fabricated the resurrection story, if they'd secretly stolen the body, like a lot of people claim that they did, you would think that at least one of them would have confessed when they faced torture or death, but none of them did. They had nothing to gain from inventing the resurrection. They didn't gain wealth or power or political influence. They instead faced persecution and execution.
Yeah, and like you said, their conviction in who Jesus was after the resurrection was completely different than what it was before. I mean, they were examples of Peter denying that he even knew Jesus, and before the resurrection, they were after the resurrection. It's a completely different story.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that to me, it's very strong evidence that.
Yeah, they truly believed that they saw Jesus alive again. And like Paul even says, I think in 1 Corinthians, I could be wrong about where he says it, but he's like, hey, if you don't believe us, go ask the people. It says Jesus, he showed himself to 500 people at one time. Like, many of them are still alive. Go ask them what they saw. They truly believed that they saw Jesus alive again. And if Jesus really did rise from the dead, if he predicted his own death many times throughout the gospel, actually died, and then rose from the dead just like he said he would do, then the other miracles, walking on water, turning water to wine, like that's a walk in the park. If you can call your shot on your own death and resurrection, I'll believe whatever I'll believe whatever you want. Like whatever you said you can do, yeah, you can do it. If you have power over death, you have power over life for sure.
Yeah. To me, one of the most compelling evidences is the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And his complete transformation, complete 180-degree turn from how he acted towards Christians before he encountered the risen Christ, right, and after. He was a persecutor of Christians, even overseeing the death of several Christians, their arrests. I mean, he hated Christians, and he hated Christ. After his encounter with the risen Jesus, completely different. I mean, he was then a powerful, powerful figure for Christianity, goes on to write, much of the New Testament. So yeah, he's to me, a very powerful case for
I agree.
Evidence for that resurrection.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's good evidence for biblical miracles, but is there any evidence that miracles still happen today? And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So we're gonna dive into that. Frank, we mentioned Frank Turek a lot. Frank Turek he's the author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He also runs an organization where he does weekly podcasts, goes around college campuses and speaks and all. And I've heard him discuss with other apologists that even atheists believe in at least 6 miracles, although they wouldn't admit to that. But, first, they believe something from nothing. In other words, the universe was created, so time, space, and matter all came into existence at one time from nothing by nothing. Mm-hmm. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
They also believe that life came from non-life. So far, no one has ever been able to show that life can come from non-life.
Right.
Another example is order from disorder. Nature doesn't produce order. No one has ever seen a hurricane take a pile of bricks and make a house from it, right? But you've seen the opposite. You've seen a hurricane completely destroy. So we know that nature doesn't take disorder and make
over
order.
Time.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah.
But we see that in life. We see that order can come from disorder through intelligent beings. The personal from the non-personal. Another one would be reason from non-reason. Mm-hmm. How do you get reason from purely matter? Yeah. If we're all just molecules in motion, we're bumping around, where does reason come from? How do we have the ability to reason? Morality from matter. Mm-hmm. Where do morals come from? We had a whole podcast on morality. So atheists, if they truly are honest with themselves, they do believe in at least 6 miracles. Okay, if God is performing miracles in the ancient past, it doesn't mean that he's still performing miracles today, right? So is there any evidence for modern miracles? And we believe that there is plenty of evidence. Dr. Craig Keener has written several books on miracles, and you can go on Amazon, look up Dr. Craig Keener Miracles, and you'll find several of his books. And Dr. Keener states that there are many, many examples of people being healed while being prayed for or shortly after prayer. He recalls one example in a podcast I was reading that an example of a woman named Andrea Anderson in Canada. And she had been blind for 12 years due to diabetes. She had attended a church service. In this case, it was a Pentecostal church, although Dr. Keener says he has many stories from all kinds of different churches. But she was attending this church, and the preacher was walking up the aisle, and he suddenly stopped by her, and he said to her, "You spirit of blindness, come out of her." He was, ordering the spirit of blindness to come out. Now, Dr. Keener says, I don't know if it was a spirit of blindness. It looks to me like it's an offshoot of diabetes, but whether it was or maybe it's a combination, I don't know what it was. But in any case, he said, now look at me, he told the lady. And she says, I can turn to you, but I can't look at you. I'm blind. But she looked at him and suddenly she could see. Everybody in church knew that she was blind because she would come in with a cane, right? She would come in with a blind cane. Everybody knew her, knew she was blind. Everybody in the church knew that now she could see because he called her up front. They demonstrated that she could now see. The pastor of the church where she attends tells Dr. Keener that he still keeps her old white cane in his office because she doesn't need it anymore. She still has diabetes, but she was healed of the blindness on that occasion, and everybody there knew it. That's just one example from his book, and he has many, many more examples. Another book by Lee Strobel, we've mentioned him several times. He's the author of The Case for Christ and many other books, but he has a book. It's the Case for Miracles. And in his book, he recalls a story of a lady named Barbara. One of Barbara's doctors called her the most hopelessly ill patient that he had ever treated. Barbara had been diagnosed with MS as a teenager, and as the disease progressed, by her early 30s, she had been bedridden for many years. And as the disease further progressed, she was unable to walk, unable to feed herself. She was blind, had oxygen 24/7, had a tracheotomy tube in her throat, and her muscles had completely atrophied. One of her doctors said she was in her final weeks of life and was totally curled up in a fetal position. Like her hands and arms couldn't even function anymore. They were all just in knots.
Yeah.
There was a local radio station in the town where she lived, and they put out a call for prayers for Barbara. And they know that at least 450 people prayed for her because that's how many letters they received and cards. So shortly after this call for prayer went out, two of Barbara's friends from church went to her house to share some of these letters with her. And while they were in her bedroom, Barbara suddenly became really agitated, right? She has a tracheotomy tube in her throat. She can't talk, but she became like really agitated, and her friends could tell that she wanted to say something. So they had to block the tracheotomy tube so she could speak. And when they blocked it, Barbara proclaimed that she had heard an audible voice that said, "My child, get up and walk." So she removes her oxygen, swings her feet out of the bed onto the floor, and for the first time in 7 years, she stood up.
Goodness.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I get chills just talking about it. Her feet actually worked. You got to remember that they were all locked up in like this tight position that she hadn't moved. Her feet worked. She could see. Her hands were actually opened up. Barbara's friends ran out of the room to get Barbara's parents. Her mom came running in thinking something terrible had happened, but when she saw Barbara standing, she froze in amazement. When Barbara walked out of her room and saw her dad, they started dancing. I mean, it was just this jubilant experience. Like here's a woman that hadn't been out of bed in 7 years because she couldn't. And she's now able to see, she's able to walk, she's able to dance. She went to church for the first time, that week. And at the church service, Barbara walked down the aisle to a standing ovation. And when her doctor saw her the next day, he was so shocked, he thought he was seeing her ghost. He literally thought he was seeing a ghost of her. He said, there is no way that this woman could be walking into me right now. So at least 3 doctors that treated Barbara all agreed that this was an absolute miracle. After a couple of surgeries that she had to heal up some things, she made a complete recovery and has gone on to live like 40 more years after this. So in Barbara's case, she had 3 doctors that had treated her, and all 3 doctors have documented in various publications that this was an absolute miracle, that there is no way that anything that modern medicine did could have helped her in this case. So yeah, her story is just amazing, truly miraculous. And then Lee Strobel, he also recounts many other documented cases in his book of blindness being cured. In Dr. Keener's book, he recounts at least 300 cases of blindness alone being cured.
Yeah. You see Jesus do that multiple times in the gospel, right? So
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Blindness and deafness is another one that people can are experiencing. And a lot of this occurs after prayer. Most of these miracles for the healing of blindness or the healing of deafness, things like that, people experience this after they've been prayed on or prayed for. And then in Strobel's book, he also discusses how maybe it's not considered miracles per se, but it's certainly a supernatural events that he describes how Muslims around the world are experiencing visions and dreams of Jesus appearing to them in a white robe and telling them that he loves them. So many Muslims are experiencing these visions that Christian organizations in some of these countries have put up billboards, telling Muslims, hey, if you've had this experience, if you've had this dream, contact us.
Whoa.
We can tell you about Jesus. And this has sparked thousands of Muslims to explore Christianity. So when they have these dreams or visions, it doesn't mean that the next day they wake up and they're a Christian, right? But it sparks a curiosity in them to start to learn about Christianity and Jesus. And large numbers of them are converting. I've heard that Iran has one of the largest populations or at least the largest increase in Christian populations over the last decade or so.
Yeah, and that's so surprising because it's an Islamic regime over there, and Christians have been persecuted in places like Iran and Nigeria for a very long time. Thousands of Christians. I think I was reading since, and this could just be in Nigeria, but since in the last 10 years, 100,000 or something an absurd number of Christians have been killed. A revival in Iran is incredible, because it's not as easy to be a Christian in Iran as it is in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So to convert to Christianity in some Islamic countries can cost you everything, including your life.
Yeah.
And in many cases, it costs them their family. Their families disown them. I mean, it's a big deal for a Muslim to convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
And it has to be a very serious thing for them. So, so obviously, not everyone receives a miracle, being prayed for. And just because you're a Christian who believes in that Jesus is God and can perform miracles doesn't mean he will, right? We can certainly attest to that.
Right.
So, why God chooses to grant miracles for some and not others is certainly beyond our understanding. The Bible tells us that God's ways are not our ways.
Yep.
And, so it's difficult to understand, well, if God can do it, why doesn't he do it in every case, So that's obviously, something that's difficult for all of us to comprehend and to understand. But you have to remember that for it to be a miracle, it's not something that occurs all the time. Miracles are something that is supernatural. If something occurred all the time, then people would just say, oh, that's just the way, that's just the way the world is, or that's just the way our bodies work. They heal themselves all the time. But we know that that's not the case.
Right.
We certainly see evidence, and I would encourage people to read Dr. Keener's books, read Lee Strobel's books, and there's a lot more out there on modern day miracles. And so God is certainly still in the miracle business. Mm-hmm. And so we certainly believe that miracles are another example of evidence, strong evidence for the existence of God. Yeah, I would just encourage people to do their own research on this and check out some of these amazing stories. Yeah.
It's I don't know, heart-wrenching topic, especially seeing modern day miracles is wild. And if miracles exist, then God exists. But if they don't, then he can't. But we can see that they do. So if you've made it this far, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to like and subscribe and share the podcast with people. And we will see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
God bless.